Marilyn Monroe, just the name, it's, well, iconic, isn't it? Instantly recognizable. A legend, really, and her story still grabs people.
Absolutely. Still fascinates.
But, beyond that dazzling image, there are always these whispers, rumors, about her being involved with, like, the occult, voodoo, maybe even darker stuff.
That's definitely out there.
So that's where we're headed in this deep dive. We've gathered quite a mix of things for you. Cultural takes, those classic juicy tabloids.
Oh, yeah, the tabloids had a field day.
Serious biographies, too, and even some, scholarly articles trying to make sense of it all.
Right, trying to unpack the myth versus the reality.
Exactly. So our mission here is pretty clear. Let's try and separate her actual documented spiritual curiosity, because there seems to be some from the really wild folklore, and maybe understand why these myths just keep sticking around.
Yeah, why do they have such staying power?
We know you want to get the key info, quickly, but properly, so we're aiming for those surprising facts without getting totally bogged down in, endless detail.
And it's interesting, isn't it, how these kinds of stories latch onto huge cultural figures, especially after they're gone.
Right, posthumously it just explodes.
Totally. Marilyn Monroe's status, combined with her tragic death in '62, it basically made her a kind of screen for people to project all sorts of legends onto.
A screen, yeah, I like that.
So while these occult stories are everywhere, it's really important to remember they mostly surged after she died. The key takeaway isn't that she was secretly, practicing dark arts.
Probably not.
Probably not. It's more that her massive fame and that sad ending created this fertile ground for, our own cultural anxieties about things like power, control, the unknown.
That makes sense. Her story became a magnet for all that stuff. And our sources, they do show she had some genuine spiritual interests.
Oh, definitely. There's evidence of that.
But it sounds like the really extreme claims, the voodoo and whatnot, that's more likely Hollywood rumor, maybe studio paranoia. We should definitely talk about that.
Yes, the studio angle is key.
And, of course, good old tabloid sensationalism. Okay, so let's get specific. What do we actually know? What did she explore, spiritually speaking?
Well, the records we have, they show that Monroe, who was under, immense pressure in Hollywood.
Unbelievable pressure.
Right. She did look for guidance, maybe comfort, in places outside the usual channels. Our sources point to documented times she consulted astrologers and psychics.
Okay, astrologers, psychics.
And maybe the most famous examples of these seances she apparently took part in with Kenny Kingston. He was a big celebrity medium back then.
Seances. In Hollywood in the 50s and 60s. Sounds like a movie plot itself, but you said this was part of a bigger thing.
Absolutely. If you put it in context, looking at the culture back then, things like astrology, psychic stuff, just looking for alternative meanings, it was actually becoming more common, especially among Hollywood types.
Really? So it wasn't just her?
No, not at all. It was a time when maybe traditional religion wasn't quite doing it for everyone, especially in that world. For Monroe specifically, the reasons seemed pretty personal distress. Looking for love, which is a big theme for her.
Yeah.
And just massive anxiety from being constantly in the spotlight. That level of fame, it's hard to imagine.
Okay, so that provides some context. Now, Anton LaVey, that name pops up constantly when you look into this. Founder of the Church of Satan. There's a pretty significant legend there, right?
Yes, and this is where things get, let's say, murky. It highlights the issue of reliable sources.
How so?
Well, the whole LaVey connection story mostly comes from LaVey himself, his own claims.
What did he claim?
He talked about having these late-night chats with her about magic. He even hinted at some kind of, youthful romance before she was famous.
Wow, okay. That's quite a claim.
It is, and those claims definitely added fuel to the fire, the whole occult side of the Monroe myth.
But reading through our sources, there seems to be a lot of skepticism about his version of events.
Exactly. A lot of skepticism. Scholarly work, biographies, journalists looking into LaVey's life. They found, inconsistencies. A pattern, maybe, of him kind of embellishing connections to famous people.
Self-promotion.
It looks that way. Beyond his own sort of colorful stories, there's really very little solid proof of any deep occult relationship or, actual rituals involving the two of them.
So nothing concrete?
Not really. You have to consider his whole persona, his claims.
Yeah.
They might have been more about building his own image, the image of his church,
Right. So take the LaVey stuff with a pretty big grain of salt then.
Okay. What about this? Jade candle spell. That sounds very specific, very
Right.
ritualistic.
Yeah, the jade candle spell. That's another one that keeps coming up in the stories after her death.
How does it usually get described?
Often in the tabloids, it's painted as the secret ritual she supposedly used for love or maybe fortune. Usually involves specific colored candles, jade being one, obviously. It's kind of a classic trope in popular ideas about witchcraft.
But again, when you actually look for hard evidence, it's just not there. If you check the credible biographies, the commentaries on religion or spirituality around her, there's like no primary source saying she actually did this.
So where did it come from? The tabloids just made it up.
It really looks like it emerged in those sensational papers after she died. It probably says more about our cultural fascination with magic and spells and how we sort of mythologize these tragic figures.
Than anything she actually did.
Exactly. It taps into that desire for a hidden, perhaps mystical explanation.
Okay, so the jade candle seems unlikely. Now, voodoo, that's another one often thrown around with Monroe. Why voodoo specifically?
Well, linking Monroe to voodoo, you kind of have to see it in the context of America back then, mid-century. There were a lot of anxieties about religions that weren't Western, weren't mainstream Christian.
Ah, the otherness factor.
Precisely. Voodoo, in popular American mind, became the sort of catch-all for anything seen as exotic, maybe forbidden, even a bit sinister. And those themes, unfortunately, sort of fit the tragic narrative people were building around Monroe.
So it wasn't about actual voodoo religious practice, but more like a scary label.
Pretty much. Think of it like maybe artists sometimes use dark imagery symbolically, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean the subject was literally evil, but it represents struggle or maybe feeling powerless, exploited. The occult stuff around Monroe can function like that.
So again, evidence-wise, linking her directly to voodoo practices.
Very thin, really scant, and mostly speculative. When it does pop up, it's usually just these little anecdotal bits, often in discussions about her death, trying to find some mysterious cause. Not solid reports of her, attending ceremonies or anything.
We even saw that anecdote, didn't we, about one of her ex-husbands supposedly being scared she'd use his hair clippings for voodoo dolls.
Yes. That's a perfect example. It shows how rumors and maybe that Hollywood paranoia just feed off each other.
Pure studio system anxiety, almost.
Right, totally. And our sources, both biographical and scholarly, they really stress how the studio system itself created this atmosphere of secrecy. They wanted to control the star's image so tightly.
Which kind of backfired, maybe, by creating mystery.
Exactly. It fueled speculation. And then you have the tabloids booming in the 60s, just ready to grab any little fragment, any rumor, no matter how shaky.
Blow it up.
And blow it up. A single anecdote gets repeated, and suddenly it's treated like a fact because people are fascinated. It's kind of darkly funny how much anxiety those studios could generate.
It really is. It's like in trying so hard to control everything, they accidentally made space for these wilder stories, and the tabloids just jumped right in.
Nailed it. That intense studio control created suspicion. And at the same time, the 1960s saw this big surge in public interest in the occult game. You saw it in movies, books, everywhere.
Perfect storm, almost.
A perfect storm. And Monroe, this huge, larger-than-life figure, she becomes the perfect place to project all society's anxieties and fascinations. The tabloids were brilliant at taking a tiny documented interest, like maybe astrology, and spinning it into these big tales of dark rituals and voodoo curses.
And her death just poured gasoline on that fire.
Absolutely. That tragic ending just cranked up the hunger for dramatic, even supernatural explanations. The occult angle provided a really compelling narrative.
It's interesting, too, how scholars look at this. It's not just about saying true or false, is it?
No, not at all. A lot of the scholarly analysis, it focuses more on how her image got mythologized. The occult stuff is just one part of that bigger process.
Like a case study in mythmaking.
Kind of, yeah. And some academics, even artists, they've used references to voodoo or the supernatural, almost like metaphors.
Metaphors for what?
For her struggles, for her lack of agency maybe, how little control she had over her own image, the constant invasion of privacy, the scrutiny.
Okay, so when we see that in art or analysis, it's probably symbolic, not a literal claim she was practicing voodoo.
Generally, yes. It's usually symbolic, using that occult imagery to explore themes like power, vulnerability, exploitation, especially in the context of celebrity, rather than saying, yes, she definitely did this.
Right. Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. How do we really separate the actual person from all this? Well, fascinating folklore.
I think the key thing is to draw a line between her documented interest in things like spiritualism, maybe psychology, which looks like a genuine way she tried to cope with personal turmoil.
And a really sensational stuff.
Exactly. And the more sensational rumors that paint her as, like, deep into voodoo or black magic, we do have records of her seeing astrologers, mediums, that kind of thing. But the stories about specific spells, jade candles, voodoo rites, pacts with demons, there's just no solid evidence.
So where did it all come from then, if not from her?
It mostly seems to boil down to maybe single anecdotes,
Yes.
often from unreliable sources, getting repeated and amplified within that whole Hollywood rumor mill, and then really turbocharged by the tabloids who knew it would sell magazines.
So ultimately, this whole occult reputation, it's more a story we've constructed around her than something reflecting her actual life.
I think that's a fair way to put it, yeah. Her supposed obsession with the occult says less about her real spiritual practices and much more about this ongoing cultural story we tell. A story born from her vulnerability, our intense fascination with her, and, well, the media's skill at invention.
And the fact these stories persist, it tells us something about ourselves.
Definitely. Maybe it reveals more about our anxieties, our desires as an audience, than it does about Marilyn Monroe herself. While she clearly searched for answers, for comfort in different spiritual places during tough times.
Which seems very human.
Very human. But the really lurid occult imagery that seems largely a product of cultural invention, part of the enduring, almost magical enchantment of her image.
That's a really powerful way to frame it. It really makes you think, doesn't it? Why do certain celebrities become these kinds of magnets for occult stories, conspiracy theories?
Yeah, what is it about them?
And what does that say about how we relate to fame, especially when it's tied up with tragedy?
That's exactly the question to mull over, isn't it?
Well, thank you for taking this deep dive with us, exploring this pretty shadowy corner of the Marilyn Monroe story.
It's a fascinating corner.
It really makes you consider that line, you know? Between someone's personal search for meaning and the public myths we end up creating around them, we genuinely love to hear what you think about all this, so please do share any thoughts or questions this deep dive might have sparked for you.